Hello and welcome to Facebook Live with BBC Live magazine in cooperation with Women's Hour. I'm Olivia Cope from Women's Hour, and today I'm joined by Nell Frizzell, the journalist, and Dr. Emily Grossman. So today we're talking about crying in the workplace, the politics of it. Is it okay? Is it ever okay? So first off, the two of you, have you ever cried in the office?
I cry all the time. I'm a very proud crier. I've cried at work. I've cried with people who are working below me, also people who are working above me. I cry in social situations. I don't just cry willy-nilly for no reason, but I'm very comfortable showing my emotions, letting them out, letting them pass through, and then moving on.
Hell yeah, I've cried at work. There have been periods where I've cried in the loos more than I've gone to the loo. Like, I think that if you're in a breakup, if you're in a sort of housing crisis, if you are worried that you're going to lose your job, or if you're suddenly overloaded at work, you of course will cry. But you don't have to do that at your desk. You don't have to do that in a meeting. But I think there is. To pretend that we don't cry is like pretending that we don't eat. It happens. So we might as well make it comfortable for everyone around to do it when they need to.
And Emily, you recently did a TED talk where you spoke about why science needs people who cry. So can you just talk about that for the people that haven't heard of it?
So for me, it's really important. I got a lot of abuse online for saying that it's okay for female scientists to cry. In fact, we should be encouraging more males, not just scientists, but people, to be able to cry, to feel comfortable expressing their emotions. And the abuse that I got online revealed to me that there's this kind of stigmatization of emotion, and there's this stereotype, particularly in science, that people who do science have to be cold and hard and unemotional and logical and analytical, and that there's no space for emotion. And not just that, but it's somehow damaging. And I found that completely ludicrous, because for me, on a personal level, on an individual level, it's hugely important to be able to allow those emotions to come through. It's a way of processing our experiences. It's a way of letting stuff out so that we don't turn it inwards and bottle emotions up, turning it inwards as stress or anxiety or depression, or even worse, potentially bottling it up and then letting it sort of spurt outwards as anger or aggression. So on a personal level, I think it's important to let those feelings come through, feel them, be with them, have a laugh about it, and if it feels good to do that, and then to move on. But secondly, and I think because of what I experienced, more importantly to express out there is the importance of emotion in terms of what it can actually do positively in the workplace for the world of work. Now, I'm from a science background and I work in the kind of science world, so that's my experience, but so that's the world that I know. But in that world, I strongly believe that an ability to cry, to express our emotions, allows access to what I call the 3 C's. So that's compassion, collaboration, and creativity. And all 3 are crucial for the development and the moving forward of scientific progression. So it's important for scientists to be able to express their own emotions and feel their own emotions so that they can feel compassion for the world around them, for their work. Scientists are deeply caring people. They care hugely about curing diseases or saving the planet or inventing life-saving equipment. And that with an access to our own emotions, we have access to feeling deeply about the work that we do. So that's compassion. Secondly, collaboration is that, again, I believe that when we are accessing our own emotions and we are comfortable with expressing our own emotions and we allow those to come through us, we're also more open to the emotions of others, to feeling empathy, to connecting with other people, to getting inside their minds, to getting inside what they're feeling and what they're wanting. And that opens the door to collaboration. And collaboration, working together, working as part of a team, is crucial for the scientific process, and of course is crucial in all industries. And then thirdly, creativity. Now, creativity is hugely important in scientific analysis and scientific rigor and scientific kind of discovery. And studies have shown that in order to be creative, our brain has to oscillate between periods of focus and relaxation. And surely we can be most relaxed when we've expressed our feelings. I mean, studies have shown that 9 out of 10 people feel better after a good cry. So when we can be in that state of relaxation, that state of openness, that state of oscillating between focus and sort of openness and relaxation, then we can access our imagination, our intuition, our feeling nature, our ability to kind of see things outside of the box, to approach problems differently, and therefore come up with new solutions to old problems. And so many of the great scientists of all time, now and back in, going back through hundreds of years, have been hugely intuitive, hugely connected to their imagination, their creativity. You have Einstein, who said that, I believe that imagination is more important than knowledge. You've got various scientists who had dreams, who came up with their scientific theories through dreams, through drawing, through art, through just thinking about things rather than kind of honing down on the purely the analysis of a situation. So in order to access all those parts of ourselves, then I believe it's really important that we allow ourselves to feel and to be wherever we are, in our body, in our heart, in our mind, as well as in our kind of intellectual process.
And even though we're talking about science there, that can be used in any workplace, the importance of creativity, working as a team, empathizing with your colleagues, because you end up spending more time with your colleagues than your family most of the time. Yeah. So what are the things that have kind of made you cry in the past at work?
I was just thinking, it's funny now, the 3 C's of my life as a freelance journalist are like crisps, coffee, cigarettes. It's not as impressive as your 3 C's at all. But even when you're working at home, there can be things that make you cry. I mean, it's stress, isn't it? That's a lot of what it is. There's frustration. I think about this a lot when I was an intern, or when I was a temp. You come into a new workplace, you might be there for a month tops, so you don't know anyone's name, you don't know where the loos are, you don't know if you're allowed to make a cup of tea, you don't know when you're meant to go for lunch. It's like almost by design going to make a young person feel vulnerable, and they're going to cry. They're going to cry in the same way that you cried when your mum took you to school for the first time. But there are also things, showing empathy. If you're interviewing, in my case, you're interviewing someone who's gone through a really harrowing or significant experience, it's not going to make you, I wouldn't burst into tears as they're talking to me, but it can be affecting. And that, like you say, that empathy is really important to be able to do your job. Most of us work with people. And so you have to be able to read people, empathise with people, understand people emotionally to be able to do your job. Otherwise, you could just be working with a load of cardboard boxes and robots, because they're going to behave really well in meetings, but it's the people that give the kind of point and the pleasure to any workplace. The things that made me cry, breakups as well, that I remember tipping, just calmly typing in an office, an open plan office, because they're a really great place to start crying, and having to just tip my head back and stare at the ceiling tiles until the tears absorb back in, because a week earlier, I'd broken up with my boyfriend, and I just thought, my entire life has spun off its axis, and I don't know what I'm doing. But being at work was an amazing kind of focus, and it did give me a stability. So I think to feel upset and to cry doesn't mean that you're not coping, doesn't mean you shouldn't be working, or you can't work, or you couldn't go into the office. It just means that there are going to be times in your working day where, as a coping mechanism, you start to cry a bit, and that's fine. It's not going to hurt anyone. You're not going to give it to anyone. It's not contagious. You can just experience that, and then exactly like Emily says, it passes through you. And it's exactly like doing a wee or being sick or blowing your nose. That it comes out, and when it's out, you feel better. And you might want to do that in the loos, or you might want to do it in your desk in front of you.
But it needs to happen.
Yeah.
So, all very normal reasons why someone would cry: stress, breakups, working in a new place. So why is it such a taboo?
Well, an expression, a showing of emotion has been stigmatised, and more so in this country probably than a lot of other countries. But it's become something that is weak, that is seen as feeble, that's seen as not a strong, powerful thing to do, which is quite ridiculous, because if you look back through history, actually, crying used to be a show of masculinity, a show of heroic behaviour. In Greek tragedies, and there was weeping and wailing, and the men who were doing this, if you look at Homer's The Iliad, the whole teams of Greek armies would break down in tears and berate themselves well on the floor. And you look at back in the Knights of the Round Table, you had Lancelot crying over Guinevere, and you had in the Bible there's loads of saints and apostles who cry. And I mean, all through literature, it's a show of strength, it's a show of power, it's a show of vulnerability, but also heroism. But for some reason over the past sort of 100 years or more, it's actually become this total clampdown on a showing of emotion. If you look back, sort of 20 years ago when Princess Diana died, one of the commentators at her funeral actually commented on the two young princes, saying how wonderful that they weren't crying. Weren't they brave? Weren't they strong? Well done. You're not shedding a tear. And that's what we've come to expect of strength and power, and particularly in men. And that's a real problem, particularly in men. I mean, suicide is the biggest killer of men under the age of 40, because there is this real mental health problem with repression and bottling up of emotions. Last summer, with the horrific attacks in Paris, one of the male reporters broke down live on air on the BBC, and then felt the need to pretty much immediately apologise, because he knew that people would see it as weakness and there was something wrong. But yet, actually, when you really look at it, but when Barack Obama cried when he's speaking about gun legislation, most people, I think, really got behind him and really thought, wow, what a transparent and honest and authentic leader that we can really trust, that we can really get behind, and who really believes passionately about what he's doing. So this sort of stigmatization is kind of twofold. It stops men from being able to express themselves, but it also means that women who are going into male-dominated environments, such as the environment I work in, science, feel that they have to then do the same and repress their emotions in order to be more like men, in order to be accepted and fit in. So it's kind of double whammy. Everybody's losing.
Yeah. I really like the idea of a heroic cry, and it's in the same way that the expectation on all of us that we should be sort of whole and expressive, that you can be artistic and scientific, that you can be emotional and rational, that you can be physical and cerebral. That the Renaissance man or woman was, the kind of embodiment of all of that. And now we've got such a prescribed idea of masculinity, such a prescribed idea of professionalism, and it absolutely serves no one. We were saying that as a woman, if you're crying, you will be attacked as vulnerable or emotional, or worst of all, hormonal. And then yet, if you don't cry, if you, like you're saying, if you repress that, if you turn that inwards, then you're seen as robotic, as cold, as unfun. That you're someone who you'll never be invited out to after work drinks. But then if you cry, you'll be seen as this kind of sad sack that's going to expunge all over everyone. So I think in that situation where we're berating everyone, it's surely because we're uncomfortable with it ourselves. And if we address that if someone crying makes me feel something so strongly that I can't look at them, or I want to shut them down, I need to think about why. Because I wouldn't feel like that if someone was laughing. I don't think this is entirely inappropriate in office situation, and so why do we do it when they're feeling the other way? And I don't like the fact that it does come down to these kind of huge gender broad brushstrokes, because actually, exactly like Emily is saying, it can be masculine, it can be feminine, it can be heroic, it can be vulnerable.
I think there's a real problem as well, in the sense that when people do show emotions, as I've experienced myself, because I sort of very openly expressed that I've cried, and when I got attacked online, I very openly said that yes, it made me cry, and I found it painful and distressing, and that I cried about it. And the response both online and in the national press was that women need to man up. And this expression of man up, I mean, what on earth does that mean? This idea that we need to clamp down those emotions, we need to become more like men, when actually men are struggling because they're not allowed to show emotions anyway. Yeah. And that actually, because I had openly said I'd cried about it, that somehow meant that I wasn't, A, getting on with my job, B, I was letting them win, whoever the them were, and that I was kind of allowing the bullies to take over, and that I should be out there fighting. Actually, that's just fighting fire with fire. That doesn't solve anything. But I think the best thing that we can do if we're confronted or if we're challenged or frustrated is feel what we're feeling, go into that feeling, allow that feeling to pass through. Yes, cry, yes, be vulnerable. But after I'd cried from the experience that I'd had that was painful, the trolling that I got, I then came back from that. It took me a few months, but I came back really strong, really clear, really able to analyse what had happened, to work out what I wanted to do about it. And 6 months later, I gave a TEDx talk about it because that was my response. So this idea that if you're going to be emotional, you're letting people win, that you're not being strong, that you're not actually fighting, that you're showing your weakness is, I think, completely the opposite of what crying can actually do.
And you just I loved that bit in the recent the football thing that's happening, that the Welsh fan who was like sobbing and sobbing, and the camera person just held on him, and he I don't necessarily understand football crying, but I respect it. But I think it was just amazing to see how that turned into this euphoric sort of I don't know, like sense of support to everyone around him, and he was being cheered, and then he was like giving a big bicep curl to the camera. And I think like why in that setting we allow it, where it's kind of an expression of physical frustration or like a huge that's a high testosterone environment, surely, in a Euro 2016 football match. And men do cry, and they cry at sport. Women cry at sport. Men cry at music. Women cry at music. And I think I just love that guy. And I really hope that he didn't get attacked online like Emily did. I imagine that he didn't. I imagine everyone was like, good on you.
And, sorry.
No, I was just going to add in, also, of course, Andy Murray crying when he lost the Wimbledon final. And actually that really allowed the country to get behind him, because we thought, we saw a real human being. We saw somebody who was just like us, who was, of course, not just like us. He's highly, just like us, really just like us, but had the same emotional...
I do see myself in him.
But a real human being, somebody who is vulnerable. Yes, he was a machine, a real god of a sports player, but also somebody emotional and vulnerable. And we saw the softer side to him, and we got behind him. And that's it. But it would be interesting to think what happens when female sports players or senior figures cry. What would happen if Hillary Clinton cried? Would it be the same as when Barack Obama cried? Or would it still be like, oh my gosh, that's weakness? Whereas men are sort of slightly more allowed that in that public domain, but in a work domain, are they allowed to cry? I mean, Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, famously cried in front of his employees and went on Oprah Winfrey saying that he'd done that. And actually, he believed it totally transformed his workplace, and his workers, again, really got behind him and were totally respectful and supportive of him doing that.
They saw that human side.
Right. But I think you do need the both. I think, if you had a CEO who was always getting emotional, it's in the same way that I feel about like when politicians use highly emotive language, and they can be choked up, and they're welling up, and they're talking about their dog or their person they met, and they can say all of that. It's obviously powerful, and an emotional argument can be a persuasive argument, but you also have to have the other side. You need people who can pick apart an argument, someone who can put things rationally, someone who can use facts and figures and analyse the argument and all of that stuff. And I think if you have to have one to have the other, because if you're ignoring all emotional expressions, then you can't really think rationally. And if you're ignoring all rational thought and just acting emotionally, then we're wrestling in porridge. Nothing is going to get achieved there. And I think, this sort of idea of whether it's the Knights Round Table or whether it's a kind of Renaissance sort of courtesan situation where you can be allowed to do both, that's when enlightenment happens. That's when there are huge steps, in there's progress and development when people are allowed to do the both. And so, of course, it annoys me when I see politicians being, possibly falsely emotional or employing that in a way that is cloying. But I would much rather it was possible for them to get, or for a boss or for a parent or whoever to get emotional, than for that to be in a kind of Victorian, which was a kind of blip in this sense, looked down on or frowned upon.
Well, let's pick up on that idea of boundaries at work. The reason I do keep looking at my phone is not because I'm hugely impolite.
She's on Tinder.
I am on Tinder. No. So many of you have got in touch with your questions on this subject. Many of you have got in touch with your questions on this subject matter, and one of them is Solanord on Twitter, says, doesn't it depend on the job? I wouldn't want the pilot of a plane to blubber on the loudspeaker.
That's good.
I think it's kind of, we're not saying, you have to cry in the middle of an office, whether you're a journalist or a scientist in a laboratory, but, go to the toilet and have that time, or speak to someone that you can rely on. Don't ignore it.
Well, I would say that I would rather a pilot who felt like they were going to burst into tears felt that they could tell people before the plane took off. Like, I would rather that they, in the same way, I would rather that they felt that they could say, I don't think I can do this today, I've just split up with my partner, rather than them think, like, I've got to repress this, I'm going to drive the plane anyway, and then they become so overwhelmed that they can't, or a train driver, or, the person who's even waxing your legs, like, you don't want them to be so emotionally overwhelmed they can't do their job, but you don't want them to ignore their emotions to the point where they can't do their job either.
And I think there is this fear as well in a lot of people that if you see someone crying, or if someone's crying, that the world is going to end and that it's never going to stop. And there's this sort of panic reaction of like, stop crying, yeah. Everything's okay. Like,
which isn't helpful.
Throw your arms around them, give them a hug, or just tell them to stop and pull themselves together, or like, there's no need to cry. And for me, those are like the worst possible reactions to have, because when I'm crying, there is a reason to cry, but if you give me a few minutes, that reason will probably have passed through me and be gone, and then I'll feel much better. So if someone just allows me to cry, or asks if I'd like a hug, sometimes I do. Lady in the street after I wanted a hug when I was crying on the way home from the tube a while ago, because I was having a moment, and I had a hug, and actually we had a laugh, and then I felt much better. Or maybe someone says, like, do you want to be left alone? Or someone says, would you like to talk about it? But this idea that if someone's crying, that we should panic because the world's going to end because they're no longer capable of doing their job, or they're no longer a sort of fully rational human being. One can be emotional and still be a fully functioning, rational, responsible human being within minutes.
And still drive a plane,
Drive
hopefully.
a plane.
Another person on Facebook has got in touch. We picked up about gender and saw the difference that Obama was treated by maybe if Hillary had cried. Kilburn Adam asks, women always get their way if they cry in a workplace. If men do, they get bullied. Is that a fair comment?
No. Sorry, no, of course it's not. Women get their own way in the sense that very few of them are in positions of seniority and they have lower pay. If that's getting our way, then it sucks. I think, and the idea that men are bullied, if dismissal, if failure to get promoted, if lower pay, if worse working conditions are not an expression of bullying, then I don't know what is. And I think women who cry, if it's a good workplace, they will be asked to explain, or they'll be asked sort of nicely why they're crying. Exactly the same thing will happen for men. And I think, I don't know, like Emily was saying, that we will sometimes respect men who are crying in a way that we wouldn't respect women who are crying. I would say, I don't respect a man for crying, I don't respect a woman for crying, I respect someone who can do their job well and also cry. That's what makes me respect them. Their gender is sort of neither here nor there, ideally. I hate the idea that women are kind of either, once they start crying in this kind of Florence Nightingale, they'll take to their bed and they're never seen again and it's the end of them, or they never really upset, they're just doing it in a kind of manipulative way. Women are not, they're not the embodiment of all of your fears. We're just people.
And if someone's being bullied at work for crying, then it says a lot more about the people doing the bullying than the person who's crying. And it's those people that need support, and those people that need help and need permission to actually access their own emotions. My opinion is that most bullies are themselves afraid of their own emotions and afraid of what they're seeing reflected in the person in front of them. So yes, if a man is bullied at work for crying, then that's a real shame, and that's a really sad thing, and that's something we need to look at. And I think if that is what people are experiencing, then that is valid, and that is something that society, we do need to change. And if women are seen to be crying to get their own way, if the outcome is that they actually get what they want because they've showed their emotion and they've expressed it in a way that is actually vulnerable and their truth, and then they get what they want, great. And it's up to an employer and a colleague to see when that's manipulation and to see when it's actually a truthful expression.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much to both of you for joining us today. Women's Hour will be talking about this subject with these two lovely ladies next week, so you can tune in then on Radio 4.